Welcome to Reaction Norm. I'm Michael McConkey, and we're your source for all that you need to know about culture. No, that's biology and culture and politics, but I'm not doing it over. All right, and today I'm joined by the team. We're all back together for the first time in some weeks. So, Patricia, welcome back.
Thank you, Michael. And we missed you last week.
Actually, you're right. You should be welcoming me back because I'm the one who was away. That's true. Good point. And Charles, how you doing there?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic.
All right. That's very good. So this episode was a little exciting getting launched, but we seem to be on our way. So today we're taking on the topic of cultural appropriation, and we all of us have our own sort of political views, but we've sort of decided on this show we don't want to be political. We're trying to stick to the science as much as we can. So this show may be a bit tricky to live up to that standard, but we're going to try to actually do that. I know that, Charles, when we were talking about it, you were very concerned about making sure that we gave a fair treatment to those who make the objections around cultural appropriation. So I thought, would you mind giving us first of all, just sort of an overview of what you think people mean by this, and I guess the best steelman case for it that you can make?
Yeah. I guess to give this context, a lot of times when people argue against someone that they feel is on another side, a different side than them, they often pick the most crazy or insane person that made a point and argue that and suggest that represents every person that kind of holds that view, right? And I mean, it's very easy because what those type of people say just seems rather absurd. But sometimes, maybe not as a whole, but within any kind of group that has certain kind of political point of view, sometimes they have some valid points. Now, that might not match your preferences, but I mean, they still might have some valid points, right? I don't have a deep understanding of cultural appropriation, but there are a few arguments that I've heard. One of them that I've heard relates to, I think, copyrights and maybe trademarks and patents. Some people argue that sometimes if you consider cultures as groups, and I don't think that's quite accurate. I think it's a little more complex than that. But if you consider just, the simple case, we have these groups and these groups have cultures. Sometimes you'll get a corporation will go in there and take a story, or maybe take a what we might call a medical practice or something like that, and then make it their own, copyright it or patent it. And the people who maybe it was part of their tradition, passed on for the parents or the peers or whatever, they might not accept the idea of copyrights or patents, and to them it feels like a kind of theft, because think copyright patent, it's backed by militaries and police. So it's a kind of violence that's threatened with this, and even sometimes inflicted if you go against it, right? So that's one argument that I think there is some point to this, right? Another one I've heard is that, or I read, was that it can be seen as a kind of mockery, right? So, for example, I think one example is there was a football team, I think called the Redskins or something like that, and the way that people would dress up as Native Americans. Some people found it offensive, right? Now, the question is were the people doing that? Were they trying to be offensive? I don't actually know. So that's another of the arguments. Another one I've read is that some people feel that, okay, so you might have different ways of dressing or different ways of talking being a way that you identify yourself as part of a group. And by, people anyone using that, it somehow diminishes it, right? I'm less sympathetic to that one than some of the other ones. But for example, maybe there's a thing that people do with their hair. I can't remember what it's called right now.
What's it called? Corn?
Yeah, I think Jamaica. I think within Jamaica they do quite a bit with their hair, and then but you see
cornrows. That's that right?
That is so white.
Yeah, you see just random Americans or Canadians doing that, and some people feel that diminishes that culture somehow. The one I think, like, just personally, and this gets a bit into my preferences, the one I probably am a bit sympathetic to is corporations going and grabbing stuff and copywriting or patent things. That one I'm somewhat sympathetic to, but yeah, I mean, but then I also have a counterpoint to all this that we can kind of get into, I guess, later. But yeah, I mean, that was the way I probably tried to steelman this, and to point out the instances where some individuals actually seem to have some point. It's just not the stuff from, like, because I think a lot of people look at the idea of cultural appropriation and just think those people are like crazy. Like, what the hell are they talking about? But some of them do have nuanced and maybe reasonable points, even if you don't agree with them.
Patricia, any thoughts on that?
No, I think that was a fairly good summary. I would just add a couple of other points. One argument that I've heard a lot is whether a group in question is sort of being exploited, in that they've got some sort of cultural tradition or like art that they make, and then another group sort of just like rips it off and sells it, and then the original group, who sort of like feels ownership over this artistic tradition or whatever, doesn't see any like financial gain from it at all. So that's another sort of like aspect that I've heard where people take issue with it. And the other is just there's a lot of talk about like cultural appropriation, sort of like the food world. And I think the argument there being is that if your family was an immigrant group and your food smells different and tastes different, people would bully you like in school, bully you because your food smelled bad or whatever. And then like later, if this food becomes like cool and like people are angry, and I guess, I don't know, the logic there is because you were mean to me in high school, you can't enjoy curry now or something. I don't know. This is the argument that I hear. And I'm not saying like, obviously it's terrible that people are bullied in school, right? But this is sort of the argument I hear, is that, you know, you didn't like me and my food when I was a teenager. So now you can just like screw yourself and stick to your like bologna sandwiches or whatever like North Americans eat. Anyway, sorry. I know we're going to get political.
We've got the two ends of the spectrum here now, clearly. So, okay, so let me jump in on some of this stuff. So I think that all the examples that you both give, I think nicely distinguished the spectrum of concerns. And we do want to get into sort of like the evolutionary and biological context of all of this, but I think it's important to make some of these distinctions that arise from the points that you guys are making. So I think an important part, when people argue against those who are making these criticisms along the lines of accusing people of engaging in cultural appropriation, the response often is that, but you're not losing anything, right? Like if it's like me using your culture, taking something from your culture, it doesn't prevent you from doing it, right? It's like any idea, right? I have an idea, it's like, it's as though Darwin were to say, I got this idea, no one else can write about this because this is my idea, right? Or something like that, right? Now, of course, that's obviously different in the case that, that you were talking about, Charles, and and I would be curious to know, actually, like something like I don't know what an example would be, but like Pocahontas, if Disney makes Pocahontas and they copyright it, well, they've copyrighted the movie and the images they've constructed for the movie, but they can't copyright the story. I mean, in this case, it's actually roughly based on historical events, right? But even in the, even if it's based upon another people's story, I wonder if that has ever been tested in court, right? But but clearly, I think that's a different situation, right? Where you're saying, I'm not allowing you, like this. You used to be able to use this, and now I'm not allowing you to use it. I'm using the strength of copyright law to or whatever, to trademark law or whatever, to take away your story. I mean, obviously, that's a different situation, right? So I think we can take that. I think we can all agree that that's not right, and we can put that aside and say that that's a legitimate criticism. So what is more questionable, and then will lead us into a discussion about where the error is in the questionableness, is this assumption that anyone who does not have the proper ethnic or genetic background or something is not able to legitimately make use of a particular practice or artifact, right? Is it fair to sort of focus on that? I don't think that's straw manning the argument. I think that's making a distinction and acknowledging that one of these complaints is actually a legitimate complaint, but really could be serious. The other is more open to debate.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, like, there are different arguments that I'm aware of that people make against cultural appropriation, right? So one of them that you're pointing out is, can a group, like maybe an ethnicity, like however you define that, can a group own a story, right? And like you pointed out, like when someone like uses a story, they're not taking anything from them. They're not like losing it. They're not stealing in a sense, right? But like, just to like a little kind of aside, when people talk about copyright, they often talk about stealing. But again, when you like copy a book, if you copy a text like online, not physical ones, but like over electronic, they're not losing anything either. You're not actually stealing in that sense, right? So I mean, like, if you accept copyright, it seems a bit odd. Like, I mean, I'm not saying you have to accept like these group ownerships, but it seems hard to defend copyright if you don't accept group ownership, right? Because you're not actually taking something from someone.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, and in fact, I was thinking when I was making my point, I was thinking precisely of that argument, right? The argument from someone like Kinsella, what's his name, Stephen Kinsella, who who's pretty strong in terms of arguing against copyright, saying it's not really legitimate, and uses that kind of argument. So I think I think you got a point. You can be inconsistent on these things. I suppose the argument that one could make, who was trying to defend the position, would be to say that copyright is a legal process, and if you want your story copyrighted, then you have to go through this legal process, right? That's the only argument I could think off the top of my head that could be made in response to that.
Sure, and then like someone who's maybe studying our culture might say, well, these are rituals and superstitions they go through to create these norms, right?
Yeah.
So I mean,
but it's just like the copyright is one of those norms, right? I mean, and it's not just a norm, right? It's like it's a coercively enforced law, right? So I mean, it's
but a lot of norms, like in different cultures, are coercively enforced also, right? I mean, yeah. I don't think like our system of law is different from the rituals and superstitions that other cultures have. And
but I don't think like oral based societies don't have the concept of copyright. I don't think, right? I mean, copyright is a concept very much constituted out of the legal institutions of particular societies.
Yeah. You could think of copyright as having like this historic tradition, and it's starting being in some social institutions and spreading to others in different parts of the world. So you could say like that's not copyright, but there are similarities, right? Like our law is just part of our superstitions and rituals that we do, just like you see it in other societies. And we might like elevate this because we grew up in this, but I mean it's not really different. And you could argue that the usefulness too might be a bit different, and it might be, but still, like it's not a separate.
But
thing.
I mean, to go back to Michael's point, though, I think that you guys are talking very philosophically about copyright, but I think like the point he was making is that like almost anybody you can't go up against Disney and copyright, right? Like they will just crush you with legal fees. And like, you know what I mean? Like, isn't that sort of what we're talking about? Is now you had like a story that used to be sort of maybe like public domain, and now one like corporation's like mine.
Yeah, I mean, like I would like to know to what degree that's and it never even occurred to me that we were going to go down this path. Actually, before we started the show, I was saying it's more interesting when it's organic, but this is what happens when it's organic. Sometimes things get totally unexpected happen. I didn't realize we talked about this, so I never thought about this. But I would be curious to know to what degree this kind of thing has been tested in court and how it's all turned out, because I don't know. I mean, there's, even in the States, they still have a lot of respect for the common law tradition for these things, right? And I'm not sure a common law tradition would actually say that you can just, take away someone's story from them. You might be able to use it, and you might be able to copyright the particular manifestations of it that you use to tell your story, but to say that no one else can now use the story, I'd be very surprised if high courts in the Anglo tradition have agreed to that. But I don't know, so I can't really say. So let's let's, oh, say, so as I was saying, so let's put, if we can, let's put that aside. Wherever we're talking about where some kind of coercive force is being used to actually prevent people from continuing to have access to their, what people would call culture. I wouldn't necessarily use that word, but we're doing that. Let's say we agree that that's wrong, right? So now there's this whole other thing, and this is not. And again, I say I don't think this is straw manning, because this is legitimately going on, and it's true that this is what gets attention, maybe in part because it's sensational, but there's also a huge amount of it going on, right? I mean, this first came to my attention with the famous videotape that probably everyone's seen now from Yale University, where what's his name, Christalis, I think it is, Chris, something like that. Anyways, he's the dean of one of the colleges at Yale University, and there's this videotape of all these students surrounding him and yelling at him and shrieking at him, and like, it's just horrible. But what a lot of people don't know is that is about cultural appropriation. Is that there was the university had actually sent out these warnings to the students about their Halloween costumes, and of course, Halloween is a real hot flashpoint for these questions of cultural appropriation. And the university had set out these warnings about not wearing costumes that are offensive to other cultures, and actually it was some of the students, because him and his wife were president of sort of the co-presidents of this college, right? I think president, whatever the technical term is, they sort of oversaw the college, maybe it was dean or something, and some of the students were complaining to his wife, saying that this seems ridiculous. Why can't we just wear costumes we want to wear? This is silly. It's too serious, right? And so she wrote this email to everyone saying, maybe we should just relax on all this thing, right? Maybe it's not quite a big deal. And this is what got these activist students, these anti-cultural appropriation students, so angry. And this is why they were yelling at her husband in this famous video clip. So this is when this actually first came to my attention as being like a hot button issue. But there's been all kinds of stuff, famous ones. There's Ottawa University has the student union got yoga classes canceled. You can't practice yoga at University of Ottawa because it's cultural appropriation. And there was a famous case of these two women in California who had gone down to Mexico and learned how to make tortillas and came back and opened a Mexican food truck, and they got driven out of business because they were
actually from Oregon. I think it was
you were right. It's Portland.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
Portland.
Portland
That's right.
area.
It was Portland. That's right. That's right. Yeah. And then of course there was the young woman who wore the kimono to her graduation dance, and some guy had written on his on Twitter, I think it was, had written I can't remember, your dress is not my culture. I don't know. It was some inane remark, but it blew up on, in social media. And so there's a lot of these sort of, famous cases. So I don't know if we're so much interested in debating the legitimacy of that may come up. But my sense is that there's a fundamental error in thinking that is going on here. And the way I would put it, so here, I'll tell you what I think. I'll give you my version of it. And you guys can tell me, you can respond to this, elaborate on it or criticize it or whatever you think. So my position on this is that the fundamental flaw in even using the term cultural appropriation as a criticism is that all culture, by definition, is appropriation. If you're not appropriating something from someone else, you're not taking something from someone else, then there's no culture taking place. And I think that the reason for this, the way to understand this, is that the word culture, actually the actual etymology of the word culture comes from was taken from agriculture, right? So the same way farmers cultivate their crops, this idea got used in social context that the older generation cultivated the younger generation, gave them the knowledge that they needed to be able to take over the society and be successful, right? And people, by the way, also make the mistake then of thinking that things are culture, books are culture, or kimonos are culture, or whatever, right? Or tortillas are culture or something, right? But they're not, right? They're artifacts of culture. Culture is what happens in people's heads and between people, right? So every instance of culture is an instance of people taking some knowledge from someone else and applying it to their own life, or probably editing it in some way to make it more useful or beneficial for them. But this is to me what culture is, and therefore there's no such thing of culture without appropriation. And this happens between individuals, and it happens when people say between cultures. I think this is really a confused way of talking, but I prefer to say like between different societies or different social groups or something like that. These ideas get appropriated, get edited, get reused, fused with other ideas to create new versions of things. It's just a much more fluid thing. And these people who make these criticisms have these really fixed, reified sort of ideas of culture. So they're wrong about culture in two ways. They assume the artifacts are the actual culture, which is not, and they're wrong about the idea that somehow culture, this thing that this sort of amorphous thing that they imagine is somehow fixed and is property and belongs to people or something like that. So that's my first run at it. I have more to say about it, but as a first run, that's what I have to say. So either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So I mean, if you look in the area of behavioral sciences that uses the labels social learning and cultural evolution, one way you can think of what culture is it's things that get passed either down like from the generations, right? So I mean, like you're learning from other people. Those other people can be your parents, they can be your friends, they can be a teacher, they can be someone you saw on the street, they could be someone you work with, they could be someone you watched in a video, or the words of someone who wrote something in a book, or whatever, or maybe a podcast, right? Like an audio podcast, but you're learning from others, right? And some of this information, like the person who originated it might not be alive anymore. And it could have been passed down like from person to person to person to person, just like over many, many years and many, many generations, right? And there's lots of stuff that get passed down. It could be, the way you tie your shoes, or that you wear shoes, or how to cook food, or how to do engineering, or how to build a house, or how to paint, or to brush your teeth, or whatever, right? And so like you use the word take, Michael, but I think take is the wrong word. You're copying in a sense, and you're learning, right? Like learning, at least when you learn from others, like is a form of copying. And you're right that it might not be an exact duplicate, and there's interesting things that happens when it's not exact duplicates, but it is something like that. I think part of it is some people look at it and they see individuals like learning from other individuals, right? And some people look at it, they see kind of like these groups like kind of going against each other. And in a sense, I don't think group is the right word, because I think people think of it being these very distinct, separate things, right? Even though like in some cases, as a simplification, it might be helpful at times to say that, but they're not really separate. And you have individuals going on. I think it's the same mistake that a lot of people like make when they think of how evolution happens in biological sense. They see species moving and merging and splitting and stuff like that. And it's not, it's individuals, right?
It's lineages. It's lineages.
Right. Right. And that's the mistake people make with biology, but it's a mistake I think people are making with culture also. And like I said, like people, I think some of this might come about because humans have adaptations around forming groups, right? And the groups can be, your family, a bunch of friends, people in a company, or whatever. And I think it makes people prone to conceive of the world in terms of groups, like whether those groups are real or not, right? And like you see this with like these kind of cultural things, but you also see it when people try to conceive of ethnicity as like necessarily being grounded in like these hard genetic groups that are separate. And it's like outside of this, like we've had, like I end up arguing with like one person we all know quite a bit, because he feels there's a certain group that he prefers, and he thinks there's got to be a genetics to back it. And it's like, there's not. I mean, you can pick whatever groups you want, but it's like, I can tell you that's not a cluster when you do PCA on the genetic data. But anyways, maybe it's that people are prone to see the world through groups. And even though there's culture gets passed down through the actions of individuals, and even though there might be clumpiness, right, within the groups, it doesn't mean there's these separate, distinct things that are kind of like going against each other.
Patricia, thoughts?
Only tangentially related to what Charles said, so I don't want to take it off in another direction, but I would just like to point out that some of the like anthropological research that's been done against group, because this is a big question too, and where people say culture really comes in to have a big effect in sort of human history, is that like why some cultures have seemed to accumulate more technology than others, and is what I believe, and this is the book we talked about last time in social learning about the secret of our success. And it seems like it has to do a lot with the size of groups. And that if a group for some reason like goes through something like catastrophic where they're cut off from other groups or they become a lot smaller, even if they had a lot of technology, they can lose it. So it does seem like that there's this idea that groups have to share, what they've learned in order to like survive, I think is, we can't all exist as little silos where everyone like gets their own information. That this has been like an organic part of human history, and this is sort of why we've gotten as far as we have.
Yeah, so I think the example that they gave in the book was of Tasmania. So the population of humans there was quite small, and one thing they noted is that they lost the bow and arrow, right? And one way that it seems like this is the case is that when you have like if you want to call like just these cultural like notions that are passed down from generation to generation, a single person doesn't contain all of it, right? So it's distributed across many individuals, and if the population is too small, you have to run the risk of losing stuff, right? And you think of it like, I think there's an analogy. I think it's an instance of this kind of cultural thing, is that you think of like just building something in a modern economy. Like I think there was a book on like how to build a pencil, but I've seen people like talk about like building toasters and other stuff. Like no one person knows how to build a pencil. No one person knows how to build a toaster. Like in general, there's all these different things that happen to like from like pulling, ore out of the ground to make the metal for a toaster, or maybe was it graphite from the ground or from rock or whatever to build the pencil, to like getting the wood, to like manufacturing, to like doing all this stuff. Like it's not contained in one person's head, it's contained in many people's head. But if you shrink the population, there might not be people to learn like all that stuff, and you can have things disappear.
So few things. So first, that book is called I Pencil. I believe it's by Lawrence Reed. It's actually a great little book. Strongly recommend it to people. The thing on the Tasmania example, I think I haven't read that book. You guys read the social learning, but I've read about the Tasmania example in other books, and they forgot a lot more than the bow and arrow.
Yeah.
There's lots of technology that they lost. But
and
I think
some of them, like they couldn't even like not make fire at one point. That like if their like fire went out for a storm, they had to like go find another village whose like fire hopefully hadn't gone out because they'd even lost like.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I know that they lost lots of technology, including fishing technology. Their diet suffered. But my recollection of that, I don't know if you guys remember the book you read explains. My recollection is that what happened there is that they used to be connected to a larger population base, but climate changed and the sea levels rose, and it isolated them on this island, and that's how they became the smaller, isolated population. But that's a great illustration about. How the interchange of culture is what keeps things dynamic, and in this case, you can say it's what sustains knowledge, but it also that interchange is what generates knowledge and creates the kind of complexity that Charles was talking about when he was talking about the example of the pencil. So I mean, this is where this idea that somehow you're going to treat culture as this like this reified object that belongs to this group, and I think you're right about that too, Charles. The idea that the sort of tribalism or the in-group, out-group thing plays into this whole dynamic around this. So you got a confusion about what culture is. You've got a confusion about how it functions, and this is mapped onto a sort of tribal us and them sort of mentality, rather than looking at the subtle ways in which all this is at a granular level, constantly going on. It's part of just the human process. So yeah, you can zoom back and sort of draw lines around people and say that, given certain particular influences, geographic or whatever, people may be doing things in a certain kind of way. But the fact is, the only way the whole process happens at any level is because it's happening at the individual level. Individuals are engaging in the process of learning. I also think you were right, Charles, by saying that I probably shouldn't say take. Now, I know what I mean by that, and I know that I'm right by using the word take, but people can certainly misunderstand what I mean and take me to suggest that, in fact, the culture is being removed, and obviously it isn't. It's being copied. It's being shared. And all this is happening at the individual level. And none of the stuff that you attribute to a social level or a group level is going to happen unless the individuals are evolved to do this. And I want to just also elaborate on one other thing. This is a point I make in more detail in my fantastic book called Darwinian Liberalism, which is linked in the notes below, and everyone should go buy it. Is that there's an evolutionary difference between people those who teach and those who learn. We tend to think that these are just flip sides of the same coin, but they're clearly not. Both teachers and learners have different fitness interests. The teachers are trying to instill knowledge in others because they benefit from the knowledge. Now, say if they're parents, then they're trying to presumably give their children skills that will help them survive, and therefore, from itself, a gene perspective, perpetuate the lineage, sort of thing. But even when they're teaching friends or teaching coalition partners or something, they're either looking for some kind of reciprocal exchange so that they'll be taught something later, or they're trying to give those people knowledge that will make them more fruitful friends or coalition partners down the road, right?
I think
but let me finish. Let me
Okay.
finish. Then you can jump in. Okay. So that's the so teachers have their incentives, and learners have their incentives. Learners are trying to gain information that are going to benefit them, but it would be evolutionarily a dead end for learners to simply learn whatever any teacher sought to teach them, because people can try and teach you things to get you to act in ways that benefit them. So, the learners have to be critical. They have to be very open to taking in new knowledge, but they can't be gullible. They've got to be willing to not learn things that other people are trying to teach them if those things are not in their interest. So these are not the same thing. Teaching and learning are not the same. They're two different strategies with different evolutionary histories that have different fitness benefits to those who are engaged in them. So this whole culture thing is a really, really complicated business. And in trying to reduce it to the idea that culture is a property that's owned by a group is so fantastically simplistic and so naive in terms of understanding what's really going on. It's just it's really a shame that so many of people are caught up in this. So I'm sorry, you guys want to jump in on that?
No,
Yeah.
I mean, I totally agree with everything you said. I think that it's important just to realize, I mean, it's also very simple why people do that. I would think usually you're a member of a group, or you deem that some group has, ended up at the bottom of the proverbial totem pole and they're sick of it and they don't want, you know what I mean? And that they don't want things that they associate with a culture that's been typically maybe like repressed or exploited or being sort of now, taken up by other groups that they feel like have been oppressive in other ways.
And the argument itself is kind of an argument from power, right?
Exactly.
Making the cultural appropriation argument is a way of trying to improve one's own fitness by gaining power, influence over other people, right?
Right.
Yeah. So just going back to some of the things you were saying, Michael, you were talking about the motivation someone would have for teaching. And you mentioned stuff like, parents teaching their kids and, they would help their kids, but
can I actually throw one thing in there, Charles? Actually, okay. One thing I should have said that I didn't say, because I mean, like it's easy to assume that parents always have the best interest towards their children because it's their lineage, right? But as Robert Trivers in his those three famous articles that Trivers wrote in the early 70s that get cited, right? Everyone remembers the reciprocal altruism and everyone remembers parental investment. People forget the third one was about parent-offspring conflict, that parents and offspring are only 50% related to each other, whereas each of them are 100% related to themselves. And so even things that that parents are teaching their children aren't necessarily in the best interest of the children, right?
Yeah, like help your siblings and stuff like that. Like in the parents' interest for siblings to help each other, but to a child, it's like, this is someone who's half related to me. I mean, you're better off helping them than you are like just a random person you meet.
Yes.
But, but again, going back to what you were saying about the reasons that people teach, and like I said, you gave the example of a parent helping their child, and the parents a person like teaching their friends, a parents teaching their children. Another reason I think that some people might teach is they're vying for social status. So, so people, for example, like if you have people paying attention to you and deferring to you, that by definition, like in a sense, like gives you a kind of social status, a kind of prestige, right? So sometimes when people are teaching and trying to get you to listen to them, it's not just like they're helping you. Now you might benefit from this, right? But the motivation might be, along lines of social status.
Yeah, and I would say this is always going to be in some kind of self-interest, and of course, in the modern world, people teach just to make money, right? People get paid to be teachers, right? So there's all kinds of different motives for the teaching, but it's always going to be, leaving evolutionary accidents aside, it's always going to be driven by some kind of self-interest, genetic interest on the part of the teacher. The same way as learners are going to discriminate, right? And that's what I was talking about when I was saying there's always an editing process involved in culture, right? People aren't just copying other people, they're also editing it at the same time. And that's what I mean when I say that people are not going to learn everything that everyone else is willing to teach them.
Yeah, well, the way you can, I guess, think of it is that just because you're learning something doesn't mean what you're learning is factually accurate or useful. Like you might think, oh, I'm learning how to like climb a tree better or cook something or hunt an animal better or, build a better house. But it might be that you're learning how to go work really hard and give me half your stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you're just trying to cause the behavior in the person, right?
Or go sacrifice your life for the tribe or the nation, right?
Yeah. And while you stay there and you're all safe, right?
That's right. Yeah. There's all kinds of things that people can teach you that aren't in your interest, and if you're not capable of exercising some kind of editing process in terms of what people are trying to teach you, you're going to be exploited.
Yeah.
So these are
exploited. I mean, to be specific, because we've been using the word like self-interest and exploit and all that, and I think that a lot of people like misunderstand that. So like, for example, like cooperation is a selfish act, right? It's where I get what I want, you get what you want, she gets what she wants, et cetera, et cetera. And we're all better off for being in that situation than not. But the thing about it is it's a positive sum situation. When I get what I want, I don't take from you, right? We all get what we want, right? We're all better off for being in the situation. And like those type of self-interest, that's also self-interest, right? And we're in this situation, you're even exploiting each other, but it's like, it's not malicious. Like you're not harming each other. You're actually helping. But
genetic self-interest, not.
No, but it's even like other kinds.
Use.
Yeah. But in the other sense, like the distinction is when it's zero sum. For me to win, you lose. Right. And in that sense, you can think of it as being malicious. Right. And that's the sense that I think you need to be careful of. In the instance of like, you go work and you give me half your stuff, that can be an instance of like, this is zero sum, right? It's not positive sum. You're not helping me. You're actually harming me, right?
And my suspicion is, and I can't actually cite any research on this, but I'm pretty clear that humans are actually pretty good at distinguishing between those two things when they're being drawn into a zero sum game where they have the potential to lose, and when they in fact have the potential to have some kind of co-benefit. I think they're actually pretty good at that. I think that, I off the top, I wasn't expecting either to talk about this, but I mean, there's all kinds of literature to show that we have tendencies to engage in coalition on the one hand, but also we've got the work of people like Lita Cosmedes that demonstrate that we clearly have some kind of cheater detection mechanism. We know them people are trying to take advantage of her. Even if we don't, even if we can't necessarily consciously identify, we have sort of a reaction to it in terms of distinguishing the processes and the relationships and where those are going to be counter beneficial to us. I think that's pretty clear.
My suspicion is that we have like stuff kind of wired into us, right? Like think of like you have the capacity to learn to be scared of certain things, right? But you're more likely you have to learn it, right? You're not automatically scared of spiders or snakes, but it's like you're more able to learn to be scared of those things rather than like a flower, for example, right?
I would like actually argue that some of that is actually hard. Isn't there evidence that some of that's hardwired, like being scared of snakes?
So what the evidence is you have a lot of stuff built into you that makes it so that it's more easy for you to learn to be scared of a snake, right? And a snake's a specific thing, not a snake-like thing, right? Not like something that slithers by you, like a snake. So you have the capacity to learn that easier, where it's much harder to make a child scared of a flower, for example, right?
There's clearly there's some kind of predisposition to certain kinds of fears.
Yeah. I just lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
I know. I'm sorry.
I wanted to say.
I'm really sorry.
I wanted to say, and I forgot what it was now. Oh my God, that's annoying the crap out of me.
But it's not. I guess I just took issue with this idea that like all fears are sort of like cultural.
Although they're not cultural. No, that's not the claim. Quite the opposite. There's this claim is that they're biological, but it's just that they need something to trigger them, right? They're available and they have to be triggered, right?
Okay.
Actually, can I just go back though and clarify something? Because I threw in that Lita Cosmetics thing, and I didn't really, you guys know what I'm talking about, but I can't assume that the viewers do.
Yeah,
so I should just quickly explain that there's this, and I won't go through what it is because it's interesting, but it's too long. But back in the 60s, this guy Peter Wasson created this test. So these 4 different cards, and you had to you had to identify a certain number of cards you would turn over to try and determine whether a hypothesis was true. And it turns out like 80% of people got it wrong. And the reason, the thinking for this is because people are so prone to confirmation bias. They were trying to prove the hypothesis right, rather than trying to prove it was wrong, and therefore they were turning over the wrong cards. So Cosmetti in the 80s, in late 80s, in her doctoral research, took this same thing, and she replicated the Wasson selection task and got the same sort of results. But then she used the exact same logical problem. It's called P&Q propositional problem, but she rendered, instead of putting it in algebraic terms, she rendered it in social terms. So it was trying to catch people who were cheating on some kind of social norm. And when it's put in those terms, then all of a sudden people, the odds, the proportions reversed, and about 80% of people got it right, rather than the 80% or so of people who got the original one wrong. And the suggestion here is that if our brains were just sort of a general purpose computer solving logical problems, then we should have been able to solve both equally, because they were equally basically the same problem. But the reason why we do so much better on the social version is what you were saying, Charles, is that we seem to be wired in some way to catch people who are trying to cheat us, or trying to cheat on social norms, because maintaining social norms have been so important to maintaining society, and having society allows us to have all the benefits of cooperation and all the kind of benefits that you cited earlier that comes from cooperation, division of labor, specialization, and all that sort of thing.
Can I just elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think you did a really good job of summing it up. But just for example, like the original Wasson selection test, like I couldn't even do. I'm not that smart, but I found it really difficult. And the idea being that if you've taken a course in logic or something, you have the tools to do it, but it's abstract and it's difficult. Whereas the easy one, when it's cheater detection, maybe that people don't really get what that means, but imagine if you were a bouncer at a bar trying to make sure nobody's drinking underage. Any idiot can be a bouncer at a bar and see who's drinking underage, right? This is a very simple task.
It seems
I wanted to make it a little bit more concrete in terms of what that means.
Yeah. Thanks for doing that. Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing, right? Because it seems like why I actually do this in my class, right? I the beginning of the class, I have a class where I talk about all this sort of stuff. At the beginning of the class, I have them do the first version of the Wasson selection test. At the end of the class, I have them do the second version. And it's just the second version, well, that's obvious. Why are we doing it? It just seems so intuitively obvious, right? Mm-hmm. But they don't understand, or I have to explain to them, that it's not so obvious, right? It feels obvious, but it's actually not, because when we did the first version, which is exactly the same problem, exactly the same relational problem, and you couldn't do it, right? So it's actually something that needs to be explained, why it feels so easy, it feels so intuitive. It seems to be because we've got an evolved psychology for solving these kind of problems, because it's so easy to be cheated when you're living in such a socially dense world, because we're such a social species, because of all the benefits that come from being social. It's easy to be cheated. So
I remembered my point when I said I lost my train of thought. Remembered a while ago.
Are you getting us back to cultural appropriation by any chance?
Sort of. What you were saying is that we have stuff that's kind of baked into us, evolved into us, that allows us to detect cheaters. And when I was given the example of that, we have stuff that allows us, that's kind of prepares us to be scared of, for example, of snakes and spiders more than flowers. I suspect there's a learning process even that goes with cheaters. So we have stuff that's baked into us, evolved into us for cheating, but then you learn also. For example, if you're the target of dark triad narcissists, you probably learn how to recognize dark triad narcissists eventually. You might not be, it might not know that at first, when you're young, but once you're kind of get screwed over or scammed by one, maybe two, it's okay, I'm starting to notice a pattern. Right. And you might not have a word for it. And you might eventually, now that we have the internet, go on the internet, start reading stuff oh, this has a name. Right. But yeah, that was my point.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I do think, like, I suspect, I mean, again, I don't know if there's any research on this, but I would not be surprised if I found out that the cheater detection stuff has to be triggered the same way as the snake fear maybe has to be triggered, right? But it doesn't mean that it's not still there, innate part of our evolved psychology, ready to go into action when needed, right?
Yeah, there's stuff that's it basically, it has this kind of plumbing that exists, right? That's built to detect cheating, and you kind of teach it to, or like it's part of your developmental system. It's probably not exactly like this, but like even your vision, it has to learn. Like you might say, okay, is vision genetic or is environmental? And I know that's a false dichotomy, but I know a lot of people think of it that way, right? But like with mammals, like the first 2 or 3 weeks after they're born, exposure to light of different orientation wires their visual cortex layer 1, and this seems to create an edge detector, right? And it's like, well, okay, is that genetic in a sense? Well, yeah, you're born with a system that when it's exposed to light of different orientation, it wires into this, and like almost every mammal is exposed to that. So it's not that it's just like, you're born, it's all finished, right? You have to get exposed to stuff and learn, and sometimes this learning, when it happens, you don't get the exact same result because what you learn is a bit different. And maybe that's like how the system's built. It's like, okay, well, there's going to be cheaters. We don't know what they're exactly like, but you'll be exposed to different things, and your cheater detection part of your mind, or if you want to think of it that way, can learn those things as time goes on, right? Or like think of like learning different kinds of food to eat and not eat, or learning a language. You're wired to be able to learn language, but which language you're going to learn is going to depend on who you're exposed to when you're very young, right? But you still have that ability.
So this has become a bit of a digression, but
Yeah.
but I think that the point, if I recollect correctly, the chain of conversation here, this is all to make the point that the process that we call culture is a really complex thing that involves all kinds of finely grained moving parts, the way that individuals and other relate to other people, and to simplify this by treating culture as though it's a thing that is owned by a fixed group is what gets us into these arguments over a cultural appropriation, but is in fact, I think, not really consistent with what we know about culture and social learning and all the things that go into, and even the complex social dynamics that result from all this. So this is all a simplification, which, like we said earlier, it's maybe not an accident, because the people who are making these arguments maybe gain some kind of social status, or even can gain perhaps resources, and the degree to which they can, get government grants or whatever to advance their culture, or this sort of thing, or protect their culture from these kind of incursions. So there's all kinds of benefits. There's no doubt fitness interests driving the people who are making these criticisms around cultural appropriation, but the criticisms themselves don't seem to be very well grounded in terms of what we know around the science and biology around this. That would be sort of my general summary. I don't know if you guys want to throw in on that.
Well said.
Covered it?
Yeah. Like I said, I think there's some arguments that
well, we're leaving out the, remember, we've agreed to leave out the more legal arguments, which we agree are a problem. If that's happening, that's a problem. I agree with that.
Yeah. So I mean, like the parts about just copying someone, personally, I'm not sympathetic to it. You could change my mind maybe, but I mean, it's like the way it comes about to me, like when I first heard of this, it's like, oh, don't let the cultures mix. It's like it seems like
the cultures mix. I know that's like listen to yourself when you say that, right? These are the same kind of people who would be like, their hair would be on fire if someone said, "Don't let the races mix," right? But don't let the cultures mix. That's okay.
that's exactly how it comes off to me. Like when I hear this, it's right. Like you can't learn from someone, like, unless like they're part of like what that person defines as being part of your ethnicity, right? Yeah. So it's like,
in fact, in those contexts, often the word culture, I think, sometimes is almost sort of a euphemism for race. They just don't want to say that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it functions that way sometimes. At least sometimes it functions that way.
Yeah, and I feel like I personally am really I'm sensitive to if people feel like they've been the victim of, I don't know, like bullying or, being disenfranchised in something, but that's sort of something, a decision you make on a personal level. And I think that like, if you're going to take that argument to its logical end, there's a lot of other good arguments on the other side as well.
Okay. All right, then. I think we put that one to bed. Another excellent episode, team. Well done.
Thanks for hosting, Michael.
Yes, it was fun. All right, so see you guys very soon.
Yep, see you later.
Okay, bye, Patricia. Bye, Charles.
See you.